In an era when night fell quickly and mercilessly, and the city streets were plunged into absolute darkness, the question of lighting was not just a matter of comfort, but also survival. Medieval England, like most of Europe, lived without the usual sources of light. There were no electric lights, gas lights, or even kerosene lamps. The main sources of light were fire and its derivatives. But how exactly did people use them to light up their homes, protect themselves from the dangers of the night, and create at least some comfort in gray conditions? For centuries, from the 11th to the 15th centuries, English homes, from humble peasant huts to stately castles, struggled with the darkness. This struggle has given rise to many inventions and practices, sometimes surprisingly simple, sometimes incredibly inventive, but always aimed at one goal: to drive away the darkness. Scarce resources, lack of technology, and the constant danger of fires made this task particularly difficult. Let's dive into the world of medieval English life and find out how our ancestors illuminated their homes using only what nature and their own ingenuity gave them. When it was necessary to quickly illuminate a large space or move around in the dark, torches came to the rescue faculty. Torches were wooden sticks wrapped in tarred cloth, soaked in fat, or smeared with tar. They gave off a bright but smoky light. Torches were relatively cheap to make, but they burned quickly and required constant exchange. The use of torches indoors was associated with a serious fire risk. Wooden structures, thatched roofs, and an abundance of combustible materials made medieval houses extremely vulnerable to fire. A single overturned torch could lead to a catastrophe, destroying not only a dwelling, but also an entire village or part of a city. Therefore, torches were more often used outdoors or in large, well-ventilated halls of castles, where the walls were made of stone. Special torch holders were often installed in the corridors of castles to reduce the risk, but even this did not guarantee complete safety. Over time, with the development of technology and building materials, safer ways of attaching torches began to appear. In some cases, they were placed in special metal baskets that prevented embers from falling to the floor. However, despite all the tricks, the torch remained a symbol of fast but dangerous and unstable lighting. Its flame was a symbol of movement, military campaigns and night guards, but not of a cozy home. The plume of acrid smoke that accompanied the burning of the torch testified to its primitive nature, but at the same time its brightness was invaluable in conditions of complete darkness. At a time when candles, especially wax candles, were a luxury item and electricity was a distant future, oil lamps were one of the most common and economical forms of lighting in medieval England. They were a universal solution for various sectors of society, from peasant huts to monastic cells, due to their ease of manufacture and relatively low fuel costs. The principle of operation of the oil lamp was elementary. It consisted of a small vessel filled with a combustible substance, fuel, into which the wick was lowered. Available and cheap animal fats, such as pork or beef lard and mutton fat, were most often used as fuel. In coastal areas and among fishermen, fish oil was widely used, which, although it emitted an extremely sharp and unpleasant smell, was easily accessible. Vegetable oils such as linseed or hemp were also used, but they were more expensive and more often used for food or medicinal purposes. Wicks were made of porous materials that were highly absorbent of fat, moss, linen cloth, and sometimes even-dried plant cores, similar to those used for rushlights. Oil lamps gave off a more stable but still rather dim light compared to torches or a large bonfire. Their main advantage lay in the duration of combustion and relative controllability. Unlike tallow candles, which could quickly burn out, the wick of an oil lamp slowly absorbed fuel, providing a steady, if weak, flame. However, like tallow candles, they were heavily smoked and gave off an unpleasant, often rancid smell, especially when using animal or fish oils. Soot settled on the walls and ceilings, and the smell permeated clothing and household items. The variety of shapes and materials of oil lamps was huge, reflecting their ubiquity. The simplest examples were clay bowls, ordinary bowls or pitchers with a small protrusion for the wick. In more affluent homes and castles, there were metal lamps made of iron, bronze, or even copper, sometimes decorated with simple engraving or forging. Stone lamps carved from soft rock were also common, This versatility of materials made them accessible to all social strata. Archaeological sites across England are constantly uncovering fragments or entire oil lamps from various eras, confirming their role in everyday life. Despite their disadvantages, oil lamps were more economical than candles, as fat or oil in medieval farming was often a byproduct or easily available resource. They were used to perform routine tasks such as reading, albeit with eye strain, needlework, sewing, cooking, or simply to light small rooms to avoid absolute darkness. For example, in artisan workshops that required longer lighting times than rushlights could provide, oil lamps were indispensable. In an effort to improve the quality of light and muffle the unpleasant smell, people experimented. Adding aromatic herbs or resins to fuel was a common practice, especially in wealthy homes and monasteries. Rosemary, thyme, juniper, or pine resin might have softened the stench of burning fat a little, giving the air a more pleasant, if faint, aroma. This made the atmosphere in the room more tolerable and even helped to create a certain mood. In monasteries where constant and prolonged lighting was required for studying manuscripts, copying books, scriptorium, prayers, and other intellectual pursuits, oil lamps were especially important. Often they were placed on special stands or hung on chains above the tables so that the light fell directly on the volumes. Medieval images of monks working by lamplight are a typical symbol of scholarship at the time. Even in the homes of ordinary peasants, the oil lamp was often the only source of light after sunset, allowing the family to gather together, do simple jobs, fix tools, or tell stories. It was a symbol of the hearth, giving a modest but vital light in the extreme darkness of the medieval night. Although oil lamps could not dispel the darkness completely, they were a reliable and affordable solution that allowed people to extend their activity beyond daylight hours and make their lives a little more comfortable and safer. One of the simplest but most effective techniques was the use of reflective surfaces. Polished metal plates, often made of tin, brass, or even silver for the rich, placed behind candles or oil lamps helped amplify and spread the meager light around the room. It was a kind of prototype reflector. In some cases, they even whitewashed the walls in certain niches to better reflect light. In addition to metal, other materials capable of scattering light, at least somewhat, could be used as reflectors. For example, smooth, light-colored stone or even polished wood may have served this function in some cases. This method was especially valuable in large halls, where every ray of light counted. The use of reflective surfaces did not require complex technologies or expensive materials, with the exception of silver, but significantly increased the efficiency of existing light sources. Walls covered with light plaster or simply whitewashed also played the role of a kind of reflectors. In medieval churches and cathedrals, where it was important to create an atmosphere of solemnity and elevation, the light surfaces of the walls and ceilings helped to distribute the light from the few windows and candles, creating a sense of space and lightness. Despite its simplicity, this method was very effective and was used everywhere, demonstrating the ingenuity of people who were forced to make do with a minimum of resources. Over time, with the development of glass production, there will be mirrors that can perform this function much more efficiently, but this will happen much later. In the meantime, the polished metal and white walls remain the best helpers in the fight against the ubiquitous darkness. Night lights, known as rushlights, were the quintessential cost-effective and affordable lighting in medieval England, especially for the lower classes of the population. Their ubiquity was due to their ease of manufacture and minimal cost, which made them a vital tool in the daily life of most Englishmen. The history of rushlights goes back centuries, long before the Middle Ages, but it was during this period that they became an integral part of everyday life. The main material was the core of the marsh reed, Phragmites australis, a plant that grew in abundance on wetlands throughout England. The manufacturing process was simple. The collected reeds were dried, then the outer green shell was carefully removed, leaving only a porous, spongy core. This core was then soaked in some kind of animal fat, usually ghee, lard, or even fish oil. Animal fats were a byproduct of animal husbandry, which was widespread in England, making them readily available and cheap. Soaking in fat was the key step in turning an ordinary plant into a wick that could burn. The rushlights burned slowly, giving off a dim but steady glow. Their illumination capacity was significantly lower than that of wax or even tallow candles, but they were quite enough to perform routine tasks in the dark. Imagine a peasant hut lit by the soft, flickering glow of rushlight as the family gathered for dinner or did needlework. This light was certainly not enough for reading or performing precise work, but it was indispensable for moving around the house, cooking, or other household needs. The duration of burning varied depending on the length of the wick and the quality of impregnation, but on average one rushlight could burn from 15 to 60 minutes. To maximize the service life of these cost-effective light sources, special holders known as rushlight holders were used. These holders were simple metal or wooden devices with a clip into which the rushlight was inserted. The clamp made it possible to adjust the length of the burning end, extending the wick as it burned. This way, it was possible to use ray light to the very end, saving every inch of valuable material. Some of the holders were portable and could be moved from room to room, allowing for flexibility in use. Others were stationary, attached to a wall or furniture to provide a constant source of light in a particular location. Historical evidence, such as property inventories and court records, shows widespread use of rushlights among the poor. They were so commonplace that they were rarely mentioned in lavish chronicles or descriptions of the nobility in their homes. But it is their prevalence among the majority of the population that makes them an important element in understanding everyday life in medieval England. Rushlights were a symbol of frugality and practicality, demonstrating how people used available natural resources to meet their basic needs in a world where artificial lighting was a luxury. Their legacy is not a bright light, but rather a constant, if dim, presence that has illuminated the lives of millions of people for centuries. In an era when central heating and electric lighting did not exist, portable braziers served a dual function in the great halls and corridors of medieval castles and palaces. Although their main purpose was to heat vast and often cold rooms, the burning coals inside them also served as a source of light, giving the rooms a dreamlike, flickering glow. The use of braziers has an ancient history dating back to Roman times and even earlier. In medieval England, braziers were usually large metal, most often iron or bronze, bowls or baskets on legs, designed to accommodate burning coals. Wood coal, produced by slowly burning wood without oxygen, was the main fuel. It burned longer and emitted less smoke than just burning wood, which was extremely important for indoor use. The braziers ranged in size from relatively small portable devices to massive structures capable of holding a significant amount of coals. They were often placed at the central points of large halls, such as the Great Hall of the castle, where feasts, receptions, and court sessions were held. In these huge rooms with their high ceilings and stone walls, it was extremely difficult to maintain a comfortable temperature. The braziers, which radiated heat in all directions, helped to soften the cold a little, making it more bearable to stay in the hall. In addition to its primary function of heating, the red-hot coals in the brazier emitted a noticeable amount of light. This light was certainly not as bright as the hundreds of candles, but it was intense enough to illuminate the nearby space and create an overall atmosphere in the hall. The soft red glow of the coals flickering in the dark added drama and mystery to the interior of the castle, especially in the evening. In environments where other light sources were expensive or impractical for such large spaces, braziers offered a convenient and relatively efficient solution. The advantage of portable braziers was their mobility. They could be moved as needed, placing them where additional heat and light were needed, for example, at the entrance to the hall to greet guests, or closer to the table during a feast. This provided flexibility that no fixed fireplace could offer. However, the use of braziers was associated with certain risks, primarily with fire hazard. Open fires and hot coals required constant monitoring by servants to prevent accidental fires. In addition, there was a risk of carbon monoxide poisoning in poorly ventilated areas, although this problem was less acute in the large, drafty halls of castles. Historical records, such as castle inventories and coal bills, confirm the use of braziers as a common item in the medieval nobility. For example, in the financial reports of royal courts and large feudal lords, they are regularly mentioned for buying large volumes of coal for heating. Despite their limited lighting capacity compared to other sources, braziers were a valuable multifunctional tool, symbolizing the practicality and adaptability of medieval society to the harsh conditions of its time. They demonstrate how even basic needs like heat and light were met with ingenuity and affordable technology. Unlike utilitarian rushlights and braziers, scallops and candle garlands in medieval England were not just a source of light, but rather a grandiose expression of luxury, status, and festive splendor. Their use was strictly limited to the most special occasions, royal feasts, grand weddings, religious and public holidays, or visits by high-ranking guests to castles and cathedrals. Such lighting transformed an ordinary space into something truly magical and unforgettable. Tallow candles made from animal fat were more affordable, but they gave off an unpleasant smell and smoked heavily. The real luxury was the use of wax candles. Beeswax was significantly more expensive, as its production required complex and time-consuming beekeeping. Beeswax candles burned much cleaner, brighter, and almost smoke-free, while emitting a light, pleasant aroma. Accordingly, the use of a large number of wax candles was a direct indicator of the great wealth and high social status of the owner of the castle or the organizer of the celebration. Creating candle scallops and garlands was an art form. Many candles, sometimes hundreds or even thousands, were suspended from the ceiling, attached to beams, hung in cascades, or formed intricate patterns. Imagine the great hall of the castle, usually dim and gloomy, transformed by the light reflecting off the polished wooden surfaces and draperies, creating a play of light and shadow that gave the room a completely different atmosphere. It wasn't just lighting, it was a performance. The light from multiple candles was bright enough to illuminate the entire hall, allowing guests to see each other, enjoy the scenery, and participate in the festivities without restrictions. However, behind this beauty and splendor, there was a huge cost and significant risks. Buying so many wax candles was astronomically expensive. The money spent on lighting a single royal feast could ensure the maintenance of an entire village for many months. In the accounts and inventories of royal courts and noble houses, there are often huge sums allocated for the purchase of wax and the manufacture of candles for holidays. In addition to financial costs, the main danger was a fire hazard. The open flames of hundreds of candles, often located near wooden structures, tapestries, and flammable materials, posed a serious threat. Fires in medieval castles were devastating, and many valuable buildings were destroyed for this reason. Therefore, the creation of candle festoons required constant and vigilant supervision by numerous servants. Special teams were on duty to extinguish the candles as they burned, trim the wicks, and quickly respond to any signs of fire. Special trays and wax traps were often used to prevent hot wax from dripping onto guests' heads or onto valuable interior items. Historical chronicles and descriptions of holidays give vivid ideas about such spectacles. For example, reports of feasts by English kings such as Henry III or Edward III often mention a great many candles used to light the festivities, or emphasizing their pomp. These candle garlands were not just a functional element, but rather a powerful symbol of power, status, and hospitality. They demonstrated the host's ability not only to provide a lavish meal, but also to provide an unprecedented level of lighting available to only a few. In a world where darkness was the norm, such an abundance of light was truly a dazzling and memorable sight, forever etched in the memories of those who had the privilege of seeing it. In the architecture of medieval castles and large buildings, especially in the donjons, main towers where space was limited and functional, various methods were used to ensure at least some penetration of light and air. One of these, though not the main, sources of light was the penetration of light from the hearth located on the lower floor through the openings in the floor to the upper tiers. The donjons of medieval castles were often multi-story structures with relatively small windows, especially on the lower levels, for security reasons. In the center of one of the lower floors, usually on the first or second floor, there was a large hearth-hor fireplace, which served as the main source of heat for the entire donjon. This hearth was vital for cooking, heating, and even some handicrafts. The light from the blazing hearth, especially at dusk or at night, was quite intense in the immediate vicinity. To allow heat and, to a lesser extent, light to circulate, as well as to facilitate communication between floors, holes or hatches could be left in the wooden or stone floors of the upper floors, отверстия или люки. These openings, originally designed for stairs, often spiral or attached, or for ventilation, unwittingly allowed some of the light and warm air from the hearth to reach the upper levels. Imagine the donjon of Norwich Castle or the White Tower of the Tower of London in the late evening. On the lower floor, perhaps in a large hall or kitchen, a huge hearth is burning. On the upper floors, where there were bedrooms, private chambers of the lord or garrison, there was darkness, rack. A faint, flickering glow from the firelight came up through an open trap door or a grated opening in the floor intended for access to the stairs. This light was certainly not sufficient for reading or performing any tasks that required accuracy, but it could give some kind of diffuse reflection, allowing, for example, to navigate in the dark or distinguish the contours of objects. In absolute darkness, even that minimal light was valuable. Moreover, smoke and heat from the hearth also rose through these openings, creating a kind of natural ventilation system and heat distribution. Although smoke was a problem for all medieval dwellings, in well-designed castles, chimneys from the hearths were provided to divert the bulk of the smoke to the outside. However, some of it mixed with warm air could rise up, which was more of a side effect than a purposeful lighting method. Historical evidence about this method of lighting is indirect. In the inventory of castles and archaeological sites, we find references to the location of hearths and the structure of floors, which allows us to reconstruct the potential distribution of light. However, it is important to emphasize that this was not a purposeful engineering decision for lighting. Rather, it was a side effect of architectural decisions related to functionality and heating. In a world where every light source was worth its weight in gold, even such a meager and random glint was not ignored and could be used for rudimentary orientation in space, especially when other light sources were unavailable or undesirable. This shows the pragmatism of the medieval inhabitants who use every opportunity to make their lives easier in conditions of limited resources. While modern man lives in a world constantly flooded with light, for the inhabitant of medieval England, darkness was a familiar and integral reality. Despite all the ingenious ways of obtaining light, from primitive night lamps to sumptuous candles, most houses, castles, and streets remained mostly in semi-darkness or total darkness. It profoundly affected the daily life, physiology, and even psychology of the people of that time. The main reason for the widespread darkness was, of course, the inaccessibility and high cost of artificial light sources. Wood used for campfires was relatively affordable, but it gave off a lot of smoke and burned quickly. Tallow candles were cheaper than wax candles, but they smoked, smelled bad, and gave off a dim, flickering light. Rushlights were the most economical, but their reasoning power was minimal. Electricity, of course, was beyond imagination. The result was that life in the Middle Ages was closely linked to the natural cycle of day and night. People woke up at dawn and went to bed shortly after dusk. The working day started at first light and ended when it was too dark to work. The winter evenings were particularly long, dark, and heavy. In the peasant houses, where there were no candles or rushlights, or they were used sparingly, the darkness after sunset was almost absolute, interrupted only by the glow of the fire in the hearth. This constant life in low-light conditions led to the fact that the eyes of medieval people were much better adapted to the semi-darkness than the eyes of modern man. They had better night vision, the ability to distinguish details in very low light. This was not just a habit, but an evolutionary adaptation necessary for survival and functioning in a world where artificial CW was rare. Current research suggests that prolonged exposure to low-light conditions can improve the eye's ability to see crepuscularly by increasing the sensitivity of the retina. Lack of light affected all aspects of life. Work and leisure. After dark, many activities became impossible. Work in the field stopped. Artisans could work by candlelight, but it was expensive. Leisure activities were limited to oral stories, songs, or simple games that did not require harsh coverage. Social interactions often took place in the light of a hearth or several candles. Safety. The darkness of the night was fraught with dangers. Traveling after dusk was risky because of the poor visibility of the roads and the threat from robbers. In cities where there was no street lighting, crime increased. Psychology. The long, dark winter months, especially in the northern regions of England, may have contributed to seasonal depression. Darkness was associated with uncertainty, fear, and spiritual darkness. The church, with its bright candles and stained glass windows, in a sense offered light and hope as opposed to the surrounding darkness. Historical documents, such as Chaucer's Canterbury Tales or everyday descriptions from medieval chronicles, abound with references to deep night, twilight, and flickering fire, which confirms the ubiquity of darkness. For example, monastic charters strictly regulated the time of getting up before dawn and going to bed, focusing on natural light. Understanding this habitual darkness is critical for an adequate understanding of life in medieval England. It was not just a household detail, but a fundamental characteristic of being, shaping everyday rhythms, cultural practices, and even human perception of the world. The struggle against darkness, though constant, was most often to adapt to it, rather than to overcome it completely, which makes medieval society unique in its attitude to light. The idea of mirror wells or hypothetical light shafts is one of the most intriguing and speculative solutions to the problem of lighting deep interior spaces in medieval buildings. Although there is little direct archaeological or documentary evidence of their widespread use in medieval England and Ireland, the concept itself does not seem entirely impossible for an era that nevertheless displayed amazing engineering and architectural achievements. The concept of light shafts directing sunlight has been known since ancient times. Roman architecture, for example, used open atriums and lucarne windows to illuminate interior spaces. However, the idea of mirror mines involves a more complex technology based on the principle of light reflection. It is assumed that such mirror wells could be narrow vertical or inclined channels piercing thick walls, or even several floors of a castle or monastery. Ideally, the interior of these shafts should have been lined with highly reflective materials. In medieval England, in the absence of modern polished glass, the following could be used as mirror surfaces, smooth polished stones. Some types of granite, marble, or even limestone could acquire sufficient reflectivity when carefully polished. This process was time-consuming but achievable. Polished metal plates, copper, bronze, or even carefully polished iron could serve as reflectors. Metals were valuable, but in strategically important places, they could be used to provide light. The production of such plates required high skill of blacksmiths. Layered materials, perhaps multi-layered structures, would be used, where light is reflected sequentially from several surfaces. The purpose of such shafts was to capture sunlight from the outside of the building, for example, from the roof or from an external wall facing the sunny side, and direct it down into deep, poorly lit rooms such as basements, dungeons, inner corridors, silts, and even some monastery cells, where windows were either impossible or too large. Small. The technical complexity of such a project would be enormous. First, the exact orientation of the shaft was required to maximize the capture of sunlight. Secondly, it was necessary to ensure that the reflective surfaces were perfectly smooth and clean, which was extremely difficult to maintain in medieval conditions. Dust, moisture, and soot would quickly reduce the effectiveness of reflection. Third, the light loss from each reflection would be significant. So even under ideal conditions, only a small amount of light would reach the endpoint. So why does this idea remain hypothetical? The lack of clear archaeological evidence supporting the existence of such complex systems is a key factor. Medieval buildings, while displaying engineering prowess, were usually based on more direct and proven methods. However, if such mines did exist, they may have been disguised, destroyed, or misinterpreted by archaeologists. For example, some narrow ventilation shafts or garbage chutes may have been mistaken for something else. However, the concept of mirror wells highlights the medieval builders' desire for innovation and their deep understanding of the principles of light physics, even if that understanding was intuitive rather than scientific. Perhaps in some particularly advanced abbeys or royal castles, where resources and craftsmen were plentiful, attempts could be made to create such systems. This could be the result of experiments aimed at improving living conditions in conditions where access to natural light was limited, and artificial lighting was expensive and dangerous. The idea serves as a reminder that medieval engineering was much more complex and invented than is sometimes commonly believed. In medieval England, and in Europe in general, the production of glass was an expensive and technologically complex process. High-quality flat glass panels capable of providing transparent and unlimited light transmission, were an incredible luxury, available only to the richest cathedrals, royal palaces, or the most noble feudal lords. That is why most of the windows in medieval houses, and even many castles, were either simply open openings, closed shutters, or covered with oiled parchment, animal skins, or horns, which, although protected from wind and rain, let in light very dimly and did not provide transparency. However, there was one interesting and relatively more affordable solution for creating at least some kind of glazing: the use of round glass discs known as bottle bottoms, or bullseyes. These discs were a byproduct of the glass blowing process. At that time, glass blowers blew out cylinders or spheres, which were then cut and smoothed. At the end of the cylinder, where it was disconnected from the blow tube, there remained a characteristic thick, non-linear round area, the bottom. These bottoms, often with concentric rings and a thickening in the center, were less suitable for making even sheets, but they were not thrown away. Instead, they were used as separate glass lenses to create mosaic windows. Master glaziers, often the same ones who made stained glass windows for churches, inserted these round discs into lead or wooden frames. Lead bindings, similar to those used in stained glass windows, made it possible to connect many such discs to form a window panel. The result was a window consisting of many small, round or irregular glass elements that together formed a kind of glazing. The advantages of this solution were obvious. Accessibility. Bottle bottoms were much cheaper than specially blown flat sheets of glass, since they were a byproduct. Light transmission. Even with distortion, glass allowed much more light to pass through than parchment or horn, making the interior look brighter and more pleasant. Protection from the elements. Windows with such discs provided protection from wind, rain, and cold, which open openings could not provide. However, this method also had significant drawbacks. Image distortion. Due to the uneven surface and thickness, especially in the center, these bottoms greatly distorted the image. Looking through such a window was like looking through a bottle. The world outside was blurry and indistinct. Not perfect transparency. Glass in the Middle Ages was far from perfectly transparent, often containing air bubbles and impurities, which further reduced clarity. Aesthetics. While this created a unique, mosaic-like appearance, such windows were not a model of elegance or functional transparency. Historical evidence, such as archaeological finds of fragments of such windows and references in construction records, confirms the use of bottle bottoms. They were common in the relatively well-to-do houses of the townspeople, in some monasteries, and even in the service buildings of castles, where more light was needed than shutters could provide. But there was no money for expensive flat glass. For example, in the ruins of medieval city houses, characteristic lead bindings for round glass are often found. This non-standard solution demonstrates the pragmatism of medieval masters and their ability to adapt available materials to solve pressing problems. In an era when technology was limited and resources were expensive, even imperfect but affordable glass was a significant step forward in the struggle for light and comfort in medieval homes. It has become a bridge between total darkness and the transparency that we are used to today. Medieval England, immersed in the darkness of the night, fought it with fire, ingenuity, and natural resources. From bonfires and earthen hearths to rare wax candles, every decision was the result of an urgent need and a desire for survival. These clever and sometimes dangerous lighting techniques shaped the way people lived, affected their health, and determined their daily routines. They remind us how far civilization has advanced in its development and how priceless is the bright and accessible light that we take for granted. Did you enjoy this trip to the past? Do you want to learn more about the daily life of people in the Middle Ages and other fascinating historical facts? Then subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss new videos and immerse yourself in the fascinating world of history with us.